Welcome back to Public Art 101. This is session 4. Right now, we're going to be exploring artist selection and contracting. So, your artist selection is going to be the number one indicator as to the success of your project. Choosing the right artist for your goals is going to indicate how that project ends up. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of artists approach community groups in order to create a project together, and that's a fine way to start. Remember, we can enter that process, it's cyclical at any point, but we need to go back and cover our bases. So even if the artist already had an idea, approached a community group, and you begin to work together, you're still going to go back and set those goals, of which, of course, that artist is going to be the one to implement. But if you're choosing a project before you have the artist selected, you want to make sure that you can choose an artist who can deliver on what you need for that project to be effective. So today we're going to explore the best practices for hiring, contracting, and paying artists, as well as how to attract the right artist to your project, and then look perhaps at an artist contract template. Now, I've said this before, I'll say it again. Artists are skilled workers. Here's a quote from Carfax. If an artist is asked to give a presentation, speak on a panel, write an artist statement, install their work, etc., they should be paid a fee for those services. So let's remember, when you hire an artist, every aspect that you ask them to do as a part of that project is a separate line item that they should be paid for. Make sure you're not piling work onto an artist that you're not paying them for, and make sure you pay them appropriately. In order to achieve success in any project, you have to know what you're asking for. So this is where that process flow we talked about early on, this is where that becomes really important. Because if your project team has very clearly outlined the objectives for your project, then you can find the right artists to meet those objectives, right? Your project team should have a broad representation of voices from both the community and the commissioning organization in order to represent a variety of perspectives about the project as a whole. There are a lot of really, really excellent artists in the world who might not have the exact skills you need for the project you're doing. So you need to create a match based on your needs. What's a good example of that? Community engagement comes up a lot. So artists traditionally aren't taught how to do community engagement. They're taught to work alone in studios and perfect their own craft and their own vision in their own way. And so if you want to do community engagement and you get an artist who has been alone in a studio for a really long time and doesn't know how to effectively engage community in their process, then that's not going to be a good match. You need to make sure that you work with artists who know how to engage community. Simple, right? Same thing as materiality. So let's say you're doing a glass project. You're not going to hire a bronze artist in order to do that. You need people who understand the materials that you need to be working with. If you want a permanent project and you hire a temporary performative artist, it's not going to work, right? Lots of brilliant artists, lots of project needs. You need to make sure that they match. You also want to make sure that there's a style of art that works for your needs. This comes up a lot with the utility box program. So the intention of the utility box program, the goal, the purpose of it is graffiti abatement. And so one of the things we've learned over the years is that if those projects have big areas of negative space, blank space within the design of the artwork, those are prime spots for tagging. So taggers will come along with their markers and they'll just do a little tag in those nice little canvases. It's almost like a frame for them. And so one of the things we ask of our utility box artists is that we want to make sure that their designs are really busy and bright and colorful, and that if somebody were to tag it, it wouldn't be seen, and then it's less of a target. Right? That's the goal. But if we hire an artist whose style is really broad, landscape, minimalistic with big, open, wide spaces, that artist is not going to meet the goals of that particular project, right? So knowing your goals up front will help you choose the artist that's right for you. So once you know what those goals are, there's lots of ways that you can hire an artist. What we see a lot of, particularly in the bigger projects, is where there would be a call to artists. These can be called lots of things. Call to artists is common. It might be known as an EOI, an expression of interest, or sometimes it's an RFP, a request for proposals, or an RFQ, request for qualifications. So all those names come up, but essentially what it is it's a call that goes out broadly that any artist can apply on, that then is evaluated based on those goals that you lay out with your project team, and you select the artist accordingly from their application. In some cases, community groups really want someone who's directly from their community. They want that hyper local feel where artists are actually a contributing part of their community to kind of add to that community feel. In that case, you might do a hyper local call, which might be much smaller. Maybe you're just going to do a posting in your newsletter. Maybe you actually are just getting referrals and friends and connections in the area. That's possible too. Hyperlocal tends to be a little bit more grassroots, finding people on a smaller scale. Direct selection is also common. So again, that might be one of those opportunities where the artist approached a community group and said, hey, let's work together on this, in which case the artist is already selected. Or maybe it's an artist that's been worked with in the past and it's the extension of the same project. So you want to make sure that you already have that artist in mind. And what happens a lot now is directories or sometimes rosters. So, directories and rosters are where artists can either sign up on their own or they can apply and be pre evaluated and put onto a list. And those lists are kind of public forum and available for groups to go in and review those artists' work and see if those are the ones they'd like to select. So, it can be a little cheaper than doing a broad scale call with a selection panel, but it still gives you access to artists that you might not normally think of or have access to that you could choose from that maybe are pre-selected or at least their applications are laid out for you in a much more simplistic way. So those are 4 really common ways of finding artists and bringing them to you. And again, I'm coming back to the slides by Nicole Wolf from her resource guide. She talks about finding an artist as well. So you'll see in this one, it's always artist season. So she says the same thing. If a community doesn't already have an artist in mind, then perhaps they'll publish a call to artists. And a standard call to artists has very basic application things in it, has a letter of interest, a CV, and examples of previous work, as well as previous engagement experience, especially if that's something you're calling for. I want to point this out because it's really, really relevant. A lot of people who are perhaps less experienced in public art will ask for a project idea or proposal in their call to artists. This is not best practice. Okay? An idea, an artist's idea is their proprietary work. So an artist should not be providing any proprietary information up front to you if they're not guaranteed to have that job already. So 2 things in that. They can't be providing you with ideas that are theirs, they own, that are copyrighted by them, but also they shouldn't be doing work that they're not being paid for, right? Remember, they're skilled laborers. So what we do instead is we hire artists based on their qualifications. So we're hiring them based on the quality of their past work and how well their skills align with the objectives and goals laid out in your project plan, right? So you're looking at those objective criteria, not on a specific idea. I am going to give you one little caveat on that. Artists who are more emerging, who are looking for more experience in order to build their resume, sometimes in those cases, applying for a project with a proposal, with an idea in mind, can be advantageous. And that's because you might not have the body of work in your history that would allow you to get hired for a project, but your idea might be strong enough that the group gets excited about your idea and wants to implement it. So sometimes, if you're more emerging, you might want to consider applying on a project that requests proposals. It does happen. Most groups don't realize that asking for a proposal is not best practice, so you'll see those calls. As you get more experienced over time, maybe you'll be less and less interested in applying for that type of call. Now, there are calls where you can apply, get shortlisted, and then paid to deliver a concept. That's different, right? They're paying you for that work. So that is a type of selection process where, because the group might want to know what they're going to get from an artist, not just trust their previous work, what they'll do is they'll shortlist down to 3 or up to 5 competitors sometimes, pay them a certain amount of money to create the concept, and then those concepts go to selection panel before they're implemented. That is one way of doing it. Usually that only happens on much bigger budget projects where they have the availability within the project budget to add some funds into that selection process. When you do a call to artists, you need to put all of your expectations into the call. So here's that pulling through of that information once again. So back at the beginning, you created your project team, you created your goals, you know what you want of your project, you're looking for an artist to match those goals. You put those in your call. So if you know that it's a specific materiality, specific engagement, specific site, specific timeline, they want to know how much money they have to work with, all of those things are also going to help the artist know if they want to apply to that project and if they feel their skills align. So the more information you can include into your call to artists, the more likely you are to attract the right artist. And then once you've created your call to artists, you want to make sure that you distribute it broadly. So again, if you're looking for someone hyper-local, then perhaps that distribution is through a community newsletter, postings in your community association, maybe in buildings and businesses around the area where you can actually target people within your community. But if it's a bigger budget project, you're trying to attract people maybe you haven't thought of before, maybe people from outside your community who can bring some new energy and vibrancy in, then you want to look at posting to social media. You want to actually pay for some postings through some art networks worldwide. Make sure that you get the word out there, because you want to get as many different types of art to look at as possible to make sure that you find that artist who's going to make your project a success. So who should select your artist? Good question. So you've put out your call to artists, you've collected some names, some resumes. Sometimes that can be 60, sometimes it can be 3. But what you want then is to have that opportunity to look at those goals you outlined, to cross-compare it with the qualifications of the artists who've applied, and make sure that they meet, that they match. What you want in order to do that is a really broad variety of perspectives. You want to make sure that as many different ways of seeing your community is included in that selection as possible, so that all of those perspectives are taken into account when you're doing that selection process. So that might include members of your project team, members of your community, and also some artists who can evaluate the artist applications as a peer assessor to really evaluate the quality of their artwork and the way that they express their own ideas through their artwork. So standard practice in the larger public art realm would be to do an uneven number of selection panel members, say 5 to 7, which is usually an equal number of community representatives as well as artist representatives, and then one person from the project team and kind of oversee that selection process. And there's a discussion and a kind of facilitated way of going through the applications, making sure that you're as objective as possible. Sometimes if you're not sure, that's where going to a concept evaluation might be really appropriate. So going back to that idea of hiring based on concept. So remember, it's not best practice to ask an artist to apply with an idea. They don't want to be giving you their work for free until you've actually hired them. That's why if you want to hire based on concept, you shortlist, you pay them a small amount, and then you can get a concept based on that. That way, you get the opportunity to see what that artist would create for you based on the specific criteria of that project itself. Although that usually only happens on bigger budget projects that can really afford to carve out some money for some concept reviews, it's also something to consider if you're a smaller community group, because a lot of groups that really worked hard to find their budget for a project, say through scraping together granting or fundraising opportunities to get as much money as they could for their art project within their community, they really, really want to be sure that they're going to get something that they love. And I get that. That makes perfect sense. And that's fine. You just have to pay the artist to provide you with that concept before you decide whether or not you want it. So just a reminder in paying your artists, How much do you pay an artist? Okay, well, if you go back to the budget one, we talk about it there. But generally, the artist fees are 10 to 15% of the overall budget. If you don't have a defined overall budget and they're doing it based on an estimate, you want to make sure that you look at things like Carfax rates, start to understand what you're asking of the artist, and add on any additional fees for tasks that you're requiring them to do, like community engagement, like fabrication, all of those things that artists do to make a project complete.
Because it was on city property, they did have guidelines for how to choose an artist, and it had to be an open competition. Um, like it couldn't just be a friend of a friend or something like that. And I think that's a good idea. So I had to think about what the requirements would be and wrote that up into an artist call and thought about where to distribute it, so it could get in front of as many people as possible. So those were a few steps that I hadn't really considered, but worked through all of that, and then I also assembled a panel of people to review, because I didn't want my own biases to be the deciding factor. I needed to be balanced out with other people. So, yeah, so I opened up the call and got in applications, and I kind of looked at other artist calls out there to figure out how to develop the criteria and how to develop the weighting. Um, I did it very I did a lot of the pre-work very formally, so that we had that structure and the meetings could actually just be very informal.
So once you've selected your artist and you've got the right artist in place and you're super excited about working with them on completing this project, it's still really important to go back to that foundation of making sure that you write down all of the expectations, document what you need and what you've agreed upon. You need to clarify those up front. So, who's responsible for documenting? Who is responsible for the community engagement costs? Who's paying for the fabrication? Where's the care and maintenance money coming from? Who's paying for the elder fees? These are all things that need to be included in that original negotiation and then written down in the contract. So the contract needs to be very clear. It's who's hiring who's responsible for what money is being delivered to the artist, and in what timing is that money being delivered. That's the general template for your artist contract. I have included a template link on the landing page, so make sure you check that out. There are lots of links online. You can find basic contracts, but really the idea is very simple. It doesn't need to be legalese. It doesn't need to be complicated. It's here's what we agree to about what you will deliver, how we will pay you, and when you'll deliver it by. And you might want to have a little thing in there about what happens if that doesn't happen, so that you've got a really clear out clause for both of you as well. So you want to be really clear up front what milestones the artist needs to meet in order to get paid, so that the artist isn't waiting until the very end of their project to get some money. The artist isn't out of pocket. The community association knows what deliverables are being paid to the artist at what time. All of that should be laid out. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the contract itself. It can be an addendum to the contract. That's often helpful because the scope of work can change over the lifespan of a project. So if the timelines shift because snow comes early one year and you have to push the project to spring, then it's going to change the timelines of your project. You don't want to have to revise your contract every time you do that, but you could revise the scope of work every time you do that. So I do the contract as the agreement, and then I have the scope of work as a living document that changes and is agreed upon throughout the process. But that they go together so that the artist and the community they're working for always really understand where those payments are coming in the process. It's also really important to remember and often to include in the contract that artists maintain copyright and moral rights of their work at all times. These are big, complicated legal issues that I'm not going to get into here, but basically, what we're saying here is that the artist's work belongs to that artist. You are commissioning it to display in the public realm. How exciting! But just because it's in the public realm doesn't mean that you get to profit off of it in a different way. So you don't get to take their work and make a decal out of it and start selling that decal as a fundraiser for your community association, okay? Unless you pay the artist an additional fee for that happening. So whatever is written in the contract that they are agreeing to deliver you is the only thing that you get to use. You do not get to take the work and use it in another way. Artists, make sure you know that. Okay? What you get paid for is what you deliver. And if there's more that's a part of you later, it's an additional fee.
And artist moral rights means that the artwork remains their intellectual property throughout the life of the artwork. It means that we don't have the right to change that artwork in any way. So conservators are very highly trained in consulting with artists, working with artists, and researching and understanding the meaning and intention of the artwork and respecting its integrity in many different ways. But it's not just conservators. It's really not up to anyone to change the artwork or reproduce it in any way. That those rights really do remain with the artist throughout their lifetime and beyond. So whenever images are taken of the artwork, whenever it's being spoken about or published on, that the artist is always consulted or compensated.
Okay. Few things that go in your artist contract. Let's go over these again. You want to talk about who the parties involved are. So these are your key contacts, maybe your project manager, somebody on the project team, so that we know who's involved in the project. We want to know what the project is, and this is direct information from the called artists. So whatever you use to hire your artist based on those objectives you created in project plan, you put those into the contract, right? It's all the same. It's all the same information pulled through. You want to know where the artwork is located. So if you have a specific site, any site limitations or expectations of the artist based on that site, what you've agreed that the work will be. So that's that scope of work document that might be separate, the timelines and the budget, how that budget's going to be delivered, those milestones. The ownership of the final artwork. So even though the artist maintains copyright and moral rights, the ownership of the work is whoever's commissioned it. Sometimes that ownership can be transferred. Who's going to own it, and then who is going to take care of it into the future, as well as who's responsible for removing it should it ever need to come out. You want to have that copyright and moral right piece in there so that it's really clear that the work is to be used only in the agreed upon ways. And you want a clause about what happens if any of these terms aren't met. We don't want it to happen, but it sometimes does. If there is conflicts or things happen and projects can't be completed. So it's really good, again, to think about the end at the beginning. So having an exit clause if conditions, goals, milestones aren't being met is actually very helpful when you get to the point of trying to end a project if it ends perhaps earlier than expected. So those are the basics of how to find, hire, and contract an artist and what can be expected in an artist contract. Artists, little tip for you, CADA does have its own artist directory. It's self-directed, so you can sign up at any time and just go online. I've got the link for you here. Sign up on the directory. It's like a little web page just for you where you can advertise your work and communities can find you if they have projects that your work might be perfect for, right? Communities go on to that directory and you can go through and you can see some of the exciting work that's available in Calgary, artists that are here, and maybe get inspired for some projects that you'd like to do within your community. Thank you for learning a little bit more about how to select and contract an artist. In our next session, session number 5, we'll be looking at how to develop a concept.